brief introduction to all the life in soils. And starting with that, it's helpful to think about our soils as, really being not just this inert substance that we often think about as, dirt, we call it, right? But soils are actually alive. And if we look at a typical soil, typical agricultural soil, there's an estimated about 5 tons or 10,000 pounds of living biomass per acre, not including roots, right? So these are just all of the bacterias and fungi and animals living in the soils. So one way to think of that is, 7, 8 large heifers roaming around below our soils on every acre. And this is an average number. It can actually vary, some very healthy soils can have 5 or even 10 times this amount of biomass. And so soils are very much alive, and there's a lot going on below ground. Even adding to that, the importance of soils, just a year or two ago, a study came out estimating that soils support roughly 58% or over half of all global biodiversity. So of all the organisms that we are aware of or think exist on this planet, 58% of them live in the soil or spend at least part of their time in soils. So what are these organisms? And I said just briefly, these are microorganisms, unicellular archaea, bacteria that are incredibly diverse and carry out a whole range of different functions. And honestly, we don't understand them that well, and they're probably the most biodiverse part of soils, but they're doing lots of very important things. Other microorganisms that we might be more familiar with are fungi, especially like mycorrhizal fungi, are hugely important for plant nutrition. And then we actually see some of these parts when we see a fruiting body of a mushroom coming up above ground. That's the above ground portion of this huge soil organism. There's also other unicellular organisms like these protists below, or amoebas, that are actually predators of bacteria and feed on small unicellular organisms and are unicellular themselves. Then if we start thinking, we move up from microorganisms to micro and mesofauna. So fauna is really talking about animals. We're talking about multicellular organisms. So some examples of these, and we could spend a lot more time talking about this, but some examples are these tardigrades that you see on the left, or sometimes known as water bears. On the right are nematodes. Nematodes encompass a whole range of different functions in the soil. Some of them feed on plants, the ones we know more, but there's actually predators and fungal and bacterial feeding nematodes that form whole communities in of themselves. And I just mentioned these are pretty extraordinary organisms, both the tardigrades and the nematodes. They're really, besides being very diverse, they're very resilient. And there's example of ice cores being pulled up in parts of the Arctic, where they found tardigrades and nematodes that have been frozen for tens of thousands of years, or tens of thousands of years, if not more. And they thaw out these samples, and these organisms come back to life. And so, yeah, they're incredibly resistant and have lots of ways to survive. Then sort of moving up in size a little bit, we talk about mesofauna. Again, many of these things probably don't look that familiar to you because many of them are too small for the naked eye and require microscopes to study. So like on the left, you see collembola, or springtails, they're called. They often feed on fungi. And if you see, let's see if I can get my pointer up here. There's your pointer. You see this little springtail here at the end, that launches them into the air, and they can jump as high as a meter, or would that be like the equivalent of a human jumping as high as the Empire State Building? So they're pretty impressive little organisms themselves. And then there's microscopic mites and incatraids and scorpions and all sorts of things that we often aren't even aware of there, but are everywhere. They say if you were to get rid of everything in the world and only leave these soil mesofauna, the nematodes and the mites and everything, that there would be a faint outline of everything, including us, around the planet. And then what I want to focus on today, and to help place this in context, are the soil macrofauna. So these are things that probably look a little more familiar, because these are things that you can see without a microscope. We can be aware of them. Many farmers are aware of them, just because we see them in our daily lives. So these are macrofauna, are earthworms, ants, termites, millipedes, spiders, slugs, anything that you see crawling around in the soil that you don't need a microscope to see. And as you maybe got the idea now, these soil organisms are largely differentiated by size. So we just see, this is a scale down here at the bottom. And then it's really this sort of limiting size, about 1 or 2 millimeters is where you can start to see things without a microscope. And so the macrofauna are largely, in this group here. But you see all these other things are much smaller and off to the left. Okay, so just to get a sense of, I gave you a sense of the biomass of organisms in the soil, but just to get a sense of the diversity, in 1 meter squared of soil, or about 10 square feet, looking down, you could have, of course, billions of microorganisms, but you could have thousands of just different species of fauna there. So these are those multicellular or eukaryotic organisms. You can have millions of individuals of micro and mesofauna, so those are nematodes and mites and everything. And in that 1 meter squared, you can have thousands of individuals of macrofauna. I've worked in some organic farm soils in Northern California, and found as many as even just 1,000 earthworms per meter squared or more. So, and that's just the earthworms. There's probably a lot more ants and other things there as well. So there's a lot of them there. What are they doing? A lot of these organisms are feeding directly or indirectly off of soil organic matter and detritus. So, our dead leaves and dead plant material are providing all of this biomass and food source for some organisms are feeding off that material directly, like earthworms, and I'll show you in a minute. Or often it's more bacteria and fungi feeding off this organic debris, and then other organisms feeding off of them. And so there's very complex food webs in the soil where everyone kind of depends on each other, but the base of it all is this detritus, or this organic matter and dead plant material. Here's just a little video to show the importance of these fauna. So on the left side, we have all the soil has been defaunated. So it's just bacteria and fungi decomposing these leaves. But on the right side, there are earthworms, columbella, isopods, or roly-polies, and a range of different organisms. And we see that over the course of, I think this is time lapse over about 15 weeks, that we see that on the right, where you have all these fauna, that they are really helping to decompose that organic matter faster. They're mixing it with soil, and they're essentially turning that litter layer into soil and making nutrients available in that organic matter for plants and crops that could be growing in that soil. So they're having huge effects and really affecting the decomposition and turnover of that detrital layer. So just now focusing specifically on soil macrofauna, this is where a lot of my work is encompassed, just because they are a little easier to study. I work with a lot of smallholder farmers around the world, where we don't need sophisticated techniques, really to go and understand what's happening in the soils biologically. And just to kind of I'll show in a minute that these organisms are very broadly distributed. They're basically found on every continent except for Antarctica. They are very valuable indicators of soil and ecosystem health, and very sensitive. And they do lots of different things and different functions in the soil that we are interested in. They are detritivores, feeding on organic matter and dead plants. They're herbivores, feeding on live plants. Some are predators, feeding on other organisms. Some are bacterivores and fungivores, and some are ecosystem engineers that completely restructure the soil. And I'll give an example of all of these in a minute. So just to convince you of the how broadly distributed these soil macrofauna are, this is a map of predicted macrofauna diversity around the world. So we see that in general, the tropics tend to have much higher diversity and probably even higher abundance. So there's more types of organisms, but it doesn't necessarily mean that these macrofauna are more important in the tropics, because you can have places like, up in closer to the Arctic Circle in Canada, where you have very high biomass of just a few organisms, say like earthworms, where they're hugely important. And so they're neither highly diverse nor abundant, but they're larger organisms. And so they're also very important for the system. So when I talk about the diversity of these systems and what they do, I mentioned detritivores. So these are organisms here, isopods, millipedes, earthworms, or different types of larvae in the soil, and many of them are detritivores, so they feed on dead plant material. They're eating dead plant leaves and roots. They're breaking them apart and fragmenting them, and they're allowing microbes like bacteria and fungi to more easily decompose that stuff. And so by doing that, they greatly accelerate the decomposition and release of nutrients from that material. And that's what we saw in that video a minute ago. And this is just some graphs showing that with different types of litter, oak litter or alder litter, this is obviously in a forested system, that when you have no fauna present, you have very slow decomposition or litter mass loss. But when you have both earthworms and isopods present, you have much faster mass loss. And again, that's exactly what we saw in the video that I showed you a minute ago. Talking with a group of farmers, I do have to recognize that many of these macrofauna, and the ones you're probably more familiar with, can be really important pests in our system. And while they may be the minority of the species that are there, they are very important, and so we need to be aware of them. And so obviously they're impacting crop productivity and ecosystem productivity. They are a major pest. Many of them feeding on roots, but then some of them can be above ground herbivores as well that maybe live part of their life cycle in the soil. And just some examples of these are the western corn rootworm, or out here in Colorado, the wheat stem sawfly that overwinters in the soil, but then goes up and eats the stems of the wheat. I work a lot in Peru, and potato weevils there are also a big potential, or a big pest there. At the same time, many of these organisms are predators and can be very important at regulating these plant pests. There's been a lot of research showing that where you have more abundant predators, spiders, predatory beetles, centipedes, things like that, that you actually have much lower pest incidence, and that can be a very effective control if you can maintain a diverse and active population of predators. And then the group that I mentioned that I study a lot and is really unique to the soil macrofauna are these soil ecosystem engineers. So these are organisms that modify or construct their own habitat and modify resource availability for themselves as well as that of other organisms. So when I'm talking about these from a soils perspective, I'm talking about things like termites, earthworms, and ants, that form these structures in the soil and completely change how our soils look and how our soils function. So just to give an example of this, this is a picture of some leafcutter ants from Central America, where they are going through and they are actually feeding on a lot of live vegetation. They're bringing it back to their nest, so they're completely redistributing nutrients and carbon associated with that vegetation and bringing it back to their nests. So they're redistributing nutrients and carbon throughout a farm or an ecosystem. They often make, this is a different type of ant, making these very deep vertical tunnels. So you can imagine how something like this would influence airflow and infiltration down into the soil. So they're having huge impacts that way. And then this is a really cool example of, a number of years ago, some scientists went out and were curious how important these, in this case, leafcutter ants were. So they noticed that there were a lot of ants out in these pastures in Brazil. And they found a dead ant nest or abandoned ant nest. And they said, well, I'm curious how big this is. So they went out with a cement truck and started filling up this nest. And they filled up, emptied a whole cement truck into it and went and got another one and kept doing this. And after they put about 10 tons of cement into this ant nest, they finally filled it up. And they found that this one nest of leafcutter ants was over 26 feet deep, with all sorts of different chambers and caverns and tunnels. And so you can just imagine what impact a nest like this and these organisms have on, aeration and water movement and distribution of nutrients and everything in these soils. And so they are truly ecosystem engineers. You can imagine termites that are perhaps more common in the tropics as being, just an extension of kind of what I showed with those ants. In some cases, they can also form huge structures that are perhaps more visible to us. So very common in not just in Africa where these pictures are, but in a lot of Latin America and tropical Asia. And so again, you can imagine that they are also changing the soil and moving nutrients and carbon around and doing a lot of the same things as ants. Earthworms, I'll show in a minute, like their ecosystem engineering activities, but they're also very important ecosystem engineers, but they're different in the sense that they're not, they're not working together as a colony, they're working as individuals. And so they have different effects that are perhaps less organized, but still equally as important. So just to give a sense of the importance of earthworms, in the world, this is from a study that came out a couple of years ago, looking at estimating the total global biomass. So this is the biomass of all living organisms, right? So of course, plants are dominating living biomass on our planet. Bacteria and archaea are also a huge part. And this is not just soils, this is the whole planet, but a lot of it's going to be in soils. And then we see this little sliver over here, animals, being just 2 gigatons of carbon. So relative to the 450 gigatons of carbon that we see in plants. And then we zoom this in to look at just all the animal biomass in the world. We see humans down here, we're 0.06 gigatons, all livestock on the planet, 0.1 gigatons. And then we see annelids here. So annelids are the group to which earthworms belong. And from what I could tell, I mean, there are important annelids in the ocean, but most of the biomass of annelids on our planet is actually earthworms, so over half. And so if you look at the biomass of earthworms, is roughly estimated to be on par with sort of the biomass of all livestock on the planet, or more, and definitely more than humans. So there are a lot of them out there, and you can imagine that they're quite important. When we look at, this is a study that came out a couple of years ago that I contributed to, trying to map the distribution of earthworms around the world. So just like we saw with the global macrofauna, now we're just focusing on one group. They are also distributed all around the planet with a few notable exceptions in the Sahara Desert and in some of the polar regions on the planet, right? And some other deserts around the world. But there are quite a few of them in wetter areas. And I will say I was part of this project. And contributed data to it, but I think this map underestimates earthworm biomass and distribution in a lot of parts of the world, because there's a lot of places here where I have taken soil samples, just didn't officially submit any, and they appear to have low biomass here, and that's not really the case. Okay, when we talk about earthworms, they are incredibly diverse, right? So there's this famous, the largest earthworm in the planet is this Gippsland earthworm in Australia, so over 11 feet long. And they're almost extinct, unfortunately, because you can imagine they don't do well with tillage. There's also the Palouse earthworm up in eastern Washington, which is also almost extinct, but another giant earthworm. There's also a lot of very large earthworms throughout the Andes and western part of South America. And then maybe some of the smallest earthworms out there are much tinier, just 3 centimeters long, this Dendrovina octedra. And so there is a whole range of them, and they're not just the ones that you typically see, up on the sidewalks when it rains, or that you find in your shovel when you go digging on your farm. For those biology nerds out there, just so our earthworms are, as I mentioned, in the phylum, the annelid phylum. And then they're ligochaetes, they're in the Heptatexid order. There's 16 different families of earthworms. And last I checked, there's about 7,000 species identified to date. So there's obviously a lot more that probably haven't been found yet. I've even found earthworms that have not been formally named yet, and I'm waiting for them. They're sitting in a lab somewhere waiting to be named, so there's more species to come. Just to get a sense, I'm not going to go through all of the biology of earthworms, but they have a mouth and they have an anus. They just typically ingest soil on one side, or organic matter, and then it passes through to the other side. They're unique in that earthworms have 5 hearts, and they have this very long intestine. And contrary to popular belief, if you cut an earthworm in half, it does not form 2 earthworms. But if you cut it far back enough on the intestine, it can survive with a shortened intestine. So often if you cut an earthworm in half, the front half will survive, the back half will not. How we go about identifying these organisms, um, the most common ones that we would find in North America, especially on our farms, are earthworms that are originally from Europe, and they are in the lumbricid family, and they can be identified with external features. So typically, you count, the shape and size of this clitellum. This is the female sex organ. Where it is on the earthworm will tell you, um, how many segments back it is from the front, and some other external features like that with a microscope. You can figure out roughly what species they are, right? And it's largely depending on both this female sex organs as well as the male sex organs up at the front, so these male pores. And this works for the lumbricids, which are the European earthworms that are probably the most common in California and across much of the farmland in North America. But for other families or juvenile earthworms that don't yet have those reproductive organisms, they're very hard to identify and often need to be done by dissections. That there's probably only 3 or 4 earthworm taxonomists in the world that can actually identify these things, and that's sort of the backlog and having the species I sent in being identified. How do earthworms reproduce? So if you've ever been digging through your soil and you see these little balls, they're about the size of a BB or a small pellet, and they look like this. These are earthworm cocoons. And so basically earthworms are hermaphrodites. Both of them, they have male and female sexual organs. And so they will typically come together like this and exchange sperm and, form these cocoons. And then, some earthworm species are actually parthenogenic. So that means that they are able to fertilize themselves. And that's a very good trait for being able to colonize new areas. If you just get one earthworm showing up in a new area, they can essentially form whole populations of genetically identical organisms. Okay, so earthworms are often separated into different ecological groups. And this has changed a bit over the years, but still fairly well recognized that we have 3 major groups. We have the epigeic earthworms, which are surface dwellers, and they're mostly living up here, right at the soil surface, maybe going into the soil a little bit, but they're essentially feeding on this litter layer. So you will only find these where you have a mulch or litter layer in place. And then these are often our earthworms that we use for vermicomposting kind of things. There are anisic earthworms, and these are the ones that form these large vertical burrows. So our typical night crawler, they're very large earthworms, and they will come feed at the surface, and then they will pull leaves down into the soil. So you'll often see, like I've seen in orchards many times, a little cast surrounded by a circle of bare soil where they've pulled the leaves down into the soil. Again, they're only living in places typically where there are less disturbance and a litter layer, like in an orchard or something. And then endogeic earthworms are probably the most abundant and common across all farmland and all ecosystems. These are subsurface earthworms, so they rarely come to the surface, feeding on more processed organic matter, maybe even feeding on casts of other earthworms at some points, and but not typically coming to the surface for much of their feeding. So yeah, these earthworms all have very different functions. You can imagine these large anisic earthworms that are making these vertical burrows are going to be really important for things like drainage, whereas these epigeics at the surface are going to be really important for turning over litter at the surface of the soil. And again, if you go digging through your soil, you can just quickly figure out, you may not be able to identify what species, but you can quickly guess which ecological group they're in just by some very simple external features. So this is our typical night crawler. So its head comes up and pulls litter out. So typically only its head or the front part of its mouth is the pigmented part, because that's where it's getting pigment to protect itself from the sun. Epigeic earthworms, the ones that feed on litter. This is Eisenia fetida, is probably the most common compost worm that we see out there. And they are pigmented throughout because they're in frequent exposure to the sun. Whereas our endogeics that are always subterranean and rarely come to the surface typically have very little pigment and are, this sort of pink color that we see here. And they don't have these darker shades that you see in the anisics or epigeics. Okay, so I kind of nerded out there with earthworms a little bit, but why do I care so much about them and what do they do? So earthworms are really important for soil structure and aggregation. Here's just an example of some earthworm casts that form these very stable organic matter rich aggregates that can persist in the soil for years, much longer than a typical aggregate in the soil. They influence infiltration and water dynamics, as I already suggested, not just the anisic earthworms, but those endogeeic ones as well. Their tunnels can be quite complex, I'll show in a minute, and really influence infiltration. They create habitat for other organisms in the soil. So other organisms are living within their tunnels that they form and feeding off of their casts. And so they're important in that way. They're hugely important for accelerating decomposition of organic matter and making nutrients more available for crops. So if we have crop residues that we've left in a field and there's a lot of earthworms there, the nutrients from those residues will become available much quicker if there are a lot of earthworms there. In that sense, they're also regulating microbial activity, and ultimately they're influencing, through all of those impacts, they're influencing plant growth and crop productivity. So here's another fun video, so you don't have to just look at my slides the whole time. So this is an example of 3 different ecological categories. So we have the anisics, the endogeics, and the epigeics. And again, they're just decomposing plant litter in this time-lapse video. And so you see that the epigeics are up here, mainly feeding on this litter. And you'll see little casts start forming at the surface where they've ingested that litter, maybe with a little soil, and then they form aggregates here. And then you have the endogeics and anisics that are coming down, forming these bigger tunnels. They're dragging organic matter down into the soil and helping enrich organic matter in deeper layers and facilitate the decomposition down below. And you see that over the course, I think this one's about 6 weeks, if I'm not mistaken, that they completely go through and decompose, most of this leaf litter. This is from a forest, presumably, and turn it into soil, essentially, in a relatively short amount of time. And we've almost gone through all the litter there, and we're almost just down to soil. I'm going to watch for a minute more because they do a really good job at the end. Anyway, I could watch these videos for hours. They're very fun. And there's lots of them online if you're interested. Okay, so earthworms as ecosystem engineers. So here again, this is surface casting of earthworms that often you'll see this type of thing where you can really see that there's earthworms there because they're depositing casts on the surface. They're also doing this in the soil. This is just more evident here. Their tunnels are often filled with casts and form preferential root growth pathways. It's easier for a root to grow down a partially filled tunnel, and at the same time, these casts are highly enriched in carbon and nutrients. Often they have double or triple the amount of available nitrogen and phosphorus as the surrounding soil. And so plants will grow down and really extract nutrients from former earthworm tunnels. This is a X-ray tomography image from a pasture in France, where again, they saw, there's a lot of earthworms out here. I wonder how many tunnels there are. And so they used this instrument that allowed them to estimate the length of tunnels. And they found in 1 meter squared that there was nearly a mile of tunnels. This is down to about a meter in depth. So just imagine you're looking down at 1 meter squared of soil, and there may be a mile of earthworm tunnels, if it's a land with a lot of earthworms. And so what does that do? This is just some of my work suggesting that the more earthworms you have, the higher infiltration rate is. And so here we used an infiltrometer, and you can see that in soils that have a lot of earthworms, you have these big pores or macropores, earthworm tunnels that really facilitate drainage. Whereas one without earthworms, you have the soils much harder for water to drain down there. That's really important for allowing soils to capture water in a big rain event, so that it can store water for later, as well as just avoiding erosion when you do get a considerable storm. So this infiltration is really important, and we want to maximize it. There was a study out a number of years ago. This is a meta-analysis where they looked at a whole range of different studies. I think they looked at about 160 studies around the world or what are the effects of earthworms on plant growth? And they differentiated this into different types of plants. And so they found that earthworms increase the productivity of grasses and grain crops, which are also grasses in most cases, by as much as 25, 30%. Legumes that fix their own nitrogen are still had a positive effect of earthworms, but not as much. It was only about a 10% increase. And that's because they think a lot of this impact is by earthworms making nitrogen more available in soils. So I then took this data and tried to estimate what is the global contribution of earthworms around the whole planet to agricultural lands, to food production. And we estimated that contribute about 7% of, how do I say this actually? About 7% of global grain production can be attributed to earthworms. So without the earthworms, we would have 7% lower grain production at current, fertilization rates. And that this is especially important in parts of Africa and Latin America, where we have lower fertilizer inputs and soils that are more conducive to a positive earthworm effect. And so, and that 7% is, equivalent to about 130 million tons of grain, or about the grain output of Russia. So that's not, it's a huge amount of grain that, we're just getting, and we're not, we're getting for free essentially without having to do anything or put anything into these soils. So it's just kind of emphasize that we really should be aware of the organisms, below our feet. And earthworms is just one example. There's probably other organisms that are equally or more important, but earthworms is one concrete example of something that can be very important. And I could talk about this all day, and I know I'm only supposed to talk for half an hour and give time for questions. So I'm going to stop there and see if there's questions. And I may have some more slides if certain questions come up, but let's see what we get.